Snow White. Loulou and Lou are going to the farm today. The apple farm.
Lou, did you hear? We're going apple picking today,
says Loulou. Apples? At the apple farm, Loulou? Asks Lou.
Yes, Lou, at the apple farm. We get to pick those really beautiful red ones.
Or those fresh green ones? Those are my favorite, says Lou.
Then we're going to pick those, Lou.
But be careful that there's not a bad poisoned apple among them, says Loulou. A poisoned one? A poisoned apple? Says Lou, surprised.
Yes, just like in the fairy tale of Snow White,
says Loulou. Oh yeah, says Lou. Would you tell that fairy tale again, Loulou? He asks. Once upon a time, there was a king and a queen who lived in their palace and had a beautiful daughter. When the child was born, it was as if the sun itself came shining into the room. The child's skin was as white as snow. Her lips were as red as blood, and her hair was as black as a raven. That's why the queen named her Snow White. But the following months were not easy for the king and his child. After Snow White's birth, the queen passed away. The king was inconsolable and did not know what to do. The years passed by. The king continued to mourn, but with time, things improved. Snow White grew up into a good girl. She was kind to the people and animals around her. Everyone in the entire land loved her. After some time, the king remarried. I think that this is what's best for the country, he said to the high servant one day. That way, Snow White will have a mother again, and the land will have a queen, because I don't think that I can do this alone, he said, almost desperately. The servant didn't know what to say and remained silent. The day of the wedding came, and Snow White was happy. The new queen, her new stepmother, must be a very sweet woman.
I can't wait to meet her, Daddy, she said happily.
But the new queen was vain. She wanted the most beautiful things in all of the land. When she saw the beautiful Snow White, she became jealous. Every day, she asked her magic mirror, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is fairest of all?" And then the magic mirror replied, "You, of course, your majesty. You are the fairest in all the land." The magic mirror was special because it always told the truth. Snow White grew up, and on her 18th birthday, the vain queen asked the mirror again, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is fairest of all?" But this time, the magic mirror answered, "You are beautiful, your majesty, but Snow White is the fairest of them all." The queen was furious when she heard this. Snow White? Snow White the fairest in all the land? She stormed out of the room. The queen was so angry that she decided to send Snow White away. She asked the hunter to take Snow White to the woods that very day and to leave her there for good. "To the woods? But why?" asked Snow White, surprised when the servant told her that she needed to go with the hunter into the woods. "These are orders from the queen, Snow White. You will go into the woods with the hunter. said the servant. Snow White nodded her head and followed the hunter outside. The journey was long, and halfway there, the good hunter became sad. He couldn't bring himself to harm Snow White, so he told her the queen's evil plan and let Snow White escape. When the hunter got back to the palace, he lied to the queen. "You will no longer be bothered by Snow White, Your Majesty," he said. The queen nodded her head. "You've done a good job. Here's your reward." She handed the hunter a bag of coins. Snow White was very relieved that the hunter had let her go. That could have been scary. As soon as the hunter told her the plan, Snow White had become very fearful. "What do I do now?" she had asked the hunter. "Go deep into the forest, Snow White. Live your life and take care that the queen never finds you," the hunter had said. After that, Snow White had run far into the woods. But now she was completely lost. The thick, gnarled trees were creaking around her. The forest was very dense and dark here, and it looked quite scary. Snow White was startled when a crow suddenly flew up. "Caw, caw, caw!" And she began to run again. A long while later, she found herself approaching a small house. She slowly opened the door. A fire was burning in the fireplace. "Hello? Is anyone there?" But nobody answered. There was no one home. Snow White was hungry and thirsty. "I really want something to eat," she said out loud. She looked in the cupboards and saw 7 small plates, 7 small bowls, and 7 small glasses. "I can probably just borrow these." Once she had eaten something, she almost fell asleep. "I'm so tired from all that running. Maybe I can lie down somewhere, just for a minute." There in the other room, she saw 7 small beds, all lined up in a row. "Huh? How strange! What kind of small people could be living here?" said Snow White, as she laid herself down on the beds and quickly fell asleep. Snow White was still sleeping when the door to the house swung open. One by one, 7 small little men walked inside. They were dwarves that worked in the mine. "Huh? Who drank something out of my cup?" shouted the first dwarf. "And who ate something out of my bowl?" said the second. And the third said, "And who used my plate?" And the fourth said, "Huh? Who nibbled from my bread?" And the fifth said, "And who picked something up with my fork?" And the sixth said, "Who cut something with my knife?" And the seventh said, "And my lemonade, who drank it all up?" The dwarves were, of course, very surprised. Was there perhaps a robber in the house? "Come quickly, let's take a look," the oldest dwarf then said. He beckoned the other dwarves to the bedroom where Snow White lay. "Oh, that's a human!" the youngest dwarf squeaked. "What do we do now? Could she be dangerous?" "No," said another dwarf. "She looks friendly." "Should we wake her up?" asked the oldest. At that moment, they heard a big yawn. Snow White started to stretch. "Oh, who are you?" she asked, a bit shocked by the 7 dwarves. One by one, Snow White and the 7 dwarves introduced themselves to one another. The 7 dwarves listened to the story of the evil queen. From that day forward, the dwarves let Snow White stay in their house and took her under their wing. Snow White found her new life with the dwarves to be quite nice. During the day, she helped the 7 little men around the house, and in the evening, she read book after book. It was calm there in the middle of nature, and she could do whatever she pleased.
I wouldn't mind staying here for the rest of my life,
said Snow White. But those happy days quickly came to an end. The evil queen quickly learned that Snow White was still alive. One morning, as she stood before her magic mirror, she asked again who was the fairest in all the land. And the mirror answered again, "You are lovely, queen, but Snow White is the fairest in all the land." "Impossible! Snow White is gone!" shouted the queen angrily. She came up with a plan to visit Snow White. The queen stood again before the magic mirror. Her hair turned gray, her face grew full of wrinkles, and her back became bent. She transformed herself into an old woman. "There," she said with a crackling tone. "Now I'll really teach Snow White a lesson." She ran out of the castle tower with a black raven on her shoulder and a blood-red poisoned apple in her hand. For hours, the evil queen wandered through the forest directly toward the house of Snow White and the 7 dwarves. The dwarves were still working in the mines, so Snow White was home alone. "Hello, young lady," the queen called out as she entered the garden. "Would you mind giving me a bit of water?" she said with her crackling voice. The sweet Snow White gave her a glass of water right away. "Ah, how sweet! As a thank you, I'll give you a delicious apple." And the evil queen gave Snow White the poisoned apple. Snow White thanked her and took a big bite. "Very good," said the evil queen slyly. Snow White looked up in surprise, but before she could say anything, the apple fell out of her hand and she fell into a deep, deep sleep. When the dwarves got home that evening, they saw Snow White lying there. "Could she have just suddenly fallen asleep right here?" asked the youngest. Snow White, wake up," said the oldest. "She isn't waking up." No matter what the dwarves did, Snow White wouldn't awaken. Slowly, the youngest dwarf began to cry. "What could have possibly happened? Look here, there's an apple." "Oh, could it be poisoned?" shouted the 3rd dwarf. The dwarves understood that the evil queen had poisoned Snow White. "What should we do now?" They were at their wits' end. How could they break the spell? The dwarves had once heard a similar evil curse was broken by true love's kiss. Week after week, the dwarves waited for Snow White's true love, but no one came. After a while, they lay the sleeping beauty to rest in a glass coffin. This way, no one can harm her when we aren't home. Because the dwarves deeply regretted that they weren't home on the day that the evil curse took place. One day, a sweet prince was riding past the house of the dwarves. The dwarves ran toward him. "Dear prince, have you come to see Snow White, that sweet sleeping Snow White?" But the prince had never heard the name Snow White before. When he heard this, he was curious to hear the story of this sleeping girl. The dwarves told him the whole tale, and the prince listened carefully. "What a story! And Snow White, where is she now? Can you bring me to her?" asked the prince. The dwarves nodded and took the prince with them to the glass coffin. The prince saw Snow White and instantly fell in love with her. He asked the dwarves if he could take Snow White with him to his kingdom, with the best doctors, in order to help her get better. The dwarves nodded their heads. That was a good idea. The youngest dwarf leaned toward the coffin and accidentally knocked it over. The coffin came to the ground with a thud. And at that moment, Snow White opened her eyes with a cough. The piece of apple came flying out of her throat. After all this time, Snow White returned to the castle where she grew up. The sweet dwarves and the good prince stayed by her side. When they got to the castle, they saw the evil witch waiting for her there. When the evil queen saw that Snow White was alive and had good people surrounding her, she became so angry that her magic mirror just, poof, broke into pieces. That wasn't very smart of the evil stepmother, because when her magic mirror broke, she lost all her power, and she could no longer do anything to Snow White, nor anyone else in the land. Since that day, Snow White ruled the land with the good prince by her side.
This might be my favorite fairy tale,
Says Lou.
Yes, but it's pretty scary with that poisoned apple,
Says Loulou. As long as we don't accidentally pick that one in a bit, she adds.
Do those really exist, Loulou? Poisoned apples from evil queens?
Asks Lou, a bit worried.
No, Lou. Poisoned apples thankfully only exist in fairy tales.
But don't swallow any seeds, because then you'll grow an apple tree in your tummy, laughs Loulou.
Yes, I've heard that one before,
chuckles Lou. And they both have a good laugh on their way to the apple farm.